For generations, the story of how the first people arrived in the Americas has been told with a familiar and confident rhythm. We learned in school that brave hunters journeyed from Asia across a vast land bridge called Beringia, chasing mammoths into a new, unpeopled world. This narrative, known as the Bering Strait theory, has been the bedrock of American anthropology for nearly a century. It painted a picture of a singular migration event, a clear and linear path that explained the origins of every indigenous person from the Arctic to the tip of South America. But what if that story, as compelling as it is only part of the picture? What if the first chapter of human history in the Americas was written not by people from Asia but by explorers from Africa? This question is not just a fringe idea whispered in the corners of academia. It is a serious inquiry now being fueled by a growing mountain of evidence from genetics, archaeology, and skeletal analysis. New discoveries are challenging the old certainties, forcing us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the peopling of the Americas. The timeline is being pushed back, the routes of travel are being redrawn, and the very faces of the first Americans are being reimagined. This emerging narrative suggests a much older, more complex, and more globally connected story, one that begins on the African continent long before the ice bridge to Asia was even a viable passageway for human migration. The implications of this shift are profound, touching upon our understanding of human ingenuity, ancient technology, and the deep, shared ancestry that connects continents. It asks us to look at the vast Atlantic Ocean not as an insurmountable barrier, but as a highway for ancient mariners who possessed a knowledge of the seas we are only now beginning to appreciate. This is a story about the people who came first, the Paleo-Americans, and the clues they left behind in their bones, their genes, and their art. These clues point overwhelmingly toward an origin that has been overlooked for far too long, an origin rooted in the same continent that gave birth to all of humanity, Africa. As we peel back the layers of history, we are finding that the first American story is not a simple tale of hunters following herds, but a grand saga of oceanic exploration and settlement. It is a narrative supported by the oldest human remains found in the Americas, which are consistently unearthed not in the north near Alaska, but thousands of miles south in places like Brazil and Chile. This geographical puzzle alone should make us pause and question the old maps. Join me as we embark on a journey to explore this new evidence, to meet the ancient peoples who defied ice and ocean, and to unveil a history that could forever change how we see the Americas and their first pioneering inhabitants. To understand who the first Americans might have been, we must first go back to the beginning of the human story itself. The scientific consensus is clear. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, originated in Africa. The out-of-Africa model, supported by a wealth of genetic and fossil evidence, tells us that our species appeared on that continent over 350,000 years ago. For tens of thousands of years, Africa was the crucible of humanity, the place where our ancestors developed the tools, the language, and the cognitive abilities that would eventually allow them to populate the entire globe. This great migration was not a single event but a series of waves, a slow and steady expansion that carried our ancestors across deserts and mountains into Asia, Europe, and Australia. This journey was one of incredible resilience and adaptation. The first modern humans to leave Africa were likely small groups of hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons and following resources. They carried with them not just their physical tools, but also a sophisticated understanding of their environment. They were observers, innovators, and explorers. We see evidence of their global trek in archaeological sites scattered across the world. For instance, the Grimaldi man, whose remains were found in Europe and date back some 40,000 years, was identified as a diminutive African who brought the advanced Aurignacian tool industry to the continent. These early modern humans were the only variety of Homo sapiens in Eurasia at the time, replacing or absorbing other hominins like the Neanderthals. The traditional narrative of American settlement inserts itself very late into this global story, suggesting that humans only reached the Western Hemisphere around 13,000 years ago. However, the logic of the out-of-Africa model invites a critical question. If early humans could reach Australia by boat as early as 65,000 years ago, a journey that required significant sea crossings, why would the Americas, particularly South America, which is geographically closer to Africa than East Asia is to North America, remain empty for another 50,000 years? The currents and wind patterns of the Atlantic Ocean, especially the powerful Canary and North Equatorial currents, could have naturally guided vessels from West Africa toward the shores of Brazil. This global context is crucial because it frames the peopling of the Americas not as an isolated anomaly, but as a logical extension of humanity's original expansion out of Africa. The skills needed to cross large bodies of water were not developed overnight. They were part of the toolkit of our African ancestors for millennia. When we consider that the oldest and most compelling evidence of human settlement in the Americas is found in South America, a direct route from Africa begins to look less like a wild theory and more like the most plausible explanation. The great human journey may have had one more oceanic chapter than we were previously taught. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence challenging the old narrative comes not from stone tools or ancient campsites, but from the remains of the first Americans themselves. When scientists perform craniometric analysis, the precise measurement of skulls, on the most ancient skeletons found in the Americas, a startling pattern emerges. These skulls, belonging to the people we call Paleo-Americans, do not resemble the skulls of modern Native Americans, or Amerins, or the populations of Northeast Asia from whom they were thought to have descended. Instead, their features align remarkably with those of African and Australo-Melanesian peoples. This has led many researchers to classify them as belonging to the black variety of humanity. Luzia, the name given to the 11,500-year-old skeleton of a young woman found in Brazil, is perhaps the most famous example. When her face was reconstructed by forensic artists, the result was astonishing. She had the features of a young African woman, with a projecting face, a broad nose, and a pronounced jaw. She looked nothing like the stereotypical image of a Paleo-Indian hunter from Siberia. And Luzia is not alone. Dozens of other ancient skulls from Mexico to Chile tell the same story. These first inhabitants of the Americas had a physical appearance or phenotype that was distinctly different from the Mongoloid populations that came to dominate the continents much later. The evidence etched in their very bones suggests they came from a different ancestral stock. This physical evidence is now being powerfully corroborated by genetics. While the story of DNA is complex, with many layers of migration over thousands of years, scientists are finding traces of African ancestry in some indigenous American populations that cannot be explained by the transatlantic slave trade. Certain markers, particularly on the Y chromosome, passed down from father to son, link some groups directly to African lineages that predate the arrival of Columbus by millennia. These are not the genes of enslaved Africans brought to the Americas after 1500. They are the genetic echoes of a much older founding population whose presence has been written over by subsequent migrations. The combination of skeletal and genetic data creates a compelling 1-2 punch against the old theory. The bones show us what the first people looked like, and the DNA begins to tell us where they came from. It suggests a scenario where an initial wave of migration from Africa established a population throughout the Americas. Much later, a subsequent wave of people from Asia crossed the Bering Strait, and over thousands of years, largely replaced or absorbed this original Paleo-American population. This explains why modern Native Americans look different from the first inhabitants, and why remnants of that original African genetic heritage can still be found today, like a faint signal from a long-lost world. For decades, the Bering Strait theory was presented not as a hypothesis but as established fact. The story was simple and elegant. As the last ice age reached its peak, sea levels dropped, exposing a massive land bridge called Beringia that connected Siberia and Alaska. Hunters, following herds of big game like mammoths and mastodons, simply walked across this bridge into a new world. However, as our understanding of geology and ancient climates has improved, significant cracks have appeared in this tidy narrative. The timing, it turns out, is all wrong. The very ice that supposedly created the land bridge also made the journey impossible during the most critical periods. The problem lies with two massive ice sheets, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran, which covered nearly all of Canada. For much of the Ice Age, these glaciers were fused together, creating an impenetrable wall of ice thousands of feet high and stretching from coast to coast. This frozen barrier would have blocked any southward migration from Alaska into the rest of the Americas. While an ice-free corridor did eventually open between the sheets, geological evidence shows this corridor would not have been a viable path for human travel, lacking food, water, or fuel, until about 12,600 years ago. This date creates a major paradox for the Bering Strait theory. The paradox is this: archaeologists have found undisputed evidence of human settlement in South America that is far older than 12,600 years. Sites like Monteverde in Chile have been securely dated to at least 14,500 years ago, with some layers suggesting an even earlier occupation approaching 18,500 years. More controversially, sites in Brazil have produced dates of 30,000 years, or even older. How could people have reached the southern tip of South America thousands of years before the only supposed entry route in the north was even open? It's a geographical and chronological impossibility. The only way to explain these early southern sites is to accept that people arrived in the Americas via a different route entirely, one that did not involve a trek through the ice. This growing body of contradictory evidence has led many prominent scientists, including Harvard geneticist David Reich, to publicly state that the classic Bering Strait model is insufficient, and that the peopling of the Americas must have been a more complex process. The theory is no longer the unassailable fact it once was. The ice that was meant to be the bridge was, for the most crucial millennia, an impassable wall. This forces us to look away from the frozen north and turn our eyes to the open ocean, considering that the first Americans were not terrestrial hunters, but skilled mariners who arrived by sea. The melting of the Bering Strait theory is paving the way for a new understanding built on oceanic voyages. The idea that ancient people could cross a vast ocean like the Atlantic thousands of years before Columbus seems at first like science fiction. We tend to imagine early humans as primitive, land-bound creatures, incapable of such sophisticated feats of navigation and boat building. But this view dramatically underestimates the ingenuity and technological prowess of our African ancestors. The ability to travel across water is not a recent invention. As mentioned, archaeological evidence confirms that humans reached Australia from Southeast Asia by at least 65,000 years ago, a journey that required crossing open ocean straits several dozen miles wide. This proves that deep-water seafaring is one of the oldest traditions of Homo sapiens. The vessel of choice for these early voyages was likely not the complex wooden ship we think of today, but something far more ancient and versatile: the reed boat. Papyrus reed boats have been used in Africa, particularly along the Nile River, for thousands of years. These vessels are remarkably buoyant, flexible, and durable. The Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl famously demonstrated their seaworthiness with his Ra-1 and Ra-2 expeditions in 1969 and 1970. He built papyrus boats based on ancient Egyptian designs, and despite some setbacks on the first attempt, successfully sailed from Morocco to Barbados, proving that an Atlantic crossing using ancient technology was entirely possible. The journey from West Africa to the northeastern coast of South America is, surprisingly, one of the most straightforward transoceanic voyages on the planet. The Canary Current flows southward along the African coast, and then merges with the powerful North Equatorial Current, which flows directly west across the Atlantic, making landfall in what is now Brazil. This system of currents acts like a natural conveyor belt. A vessel caught in these currents, even a simple one with a rudimentary sail, would be carried inexorably toward the Americas. For ancient mariners, this would not have been a blind, random drift but a navigable route guided by predictable winds and currents known to coastal peoples. This oceanic route elegantly solves the chronological and geographical problems that plague the Bering Strait theory. It explains how people could have arrived in South America first, establishing settlements like Monteverde long before the northern ice corridor opened. It aligns with the craniometric evidence showing that the first Americans resembled Africans, not Asians. The image of the first American is thus transformed from a hunter cloaked in furs, trekking across ice, to a mariner cloaked in woven fibers, navigating by the stars across a warm sea. It is a testament to a forgotten age of oceanic exploration, driven by the same human impulse for discovery that has defined our species from the beginning. While skulls and skeletons provide a snapshot of what ancient people looked like, genetics offers a living library of their journeys. The study of DNA from modern indigenous populations is revealing a complex tapestry of ancestry, woven with threads that lead back to unexpected places. For years, the focus was almost exclusively on finding links to Asia to support the Bering Strait theory. However, as genetic sequencing becomes more advanced, persistent and undeniable signals of African ancestry are emerging in some Native American groups, and this ancestry cannot be attributed to the relatively recent transatlantic slave trade. These are ancient genetic echoes, faint but clear, of a much earlier African presence. One of the most compelling examples comes from the Maya people of Central America. Genetic studies have identified the presence of African Y chromosome haplogroups, specific genetic markers passed from father to son, within the Mayan population. These markers are distinct from those associated with Africans who arrived during the colonial era. Their deep integration into the Mayan gene pool suggests an ancient origin, a founding contribution to their genetic makeup thousands of years ago. This discovery directly contradicts the notion that the Americas were genetically isolated from the rest of the world until 1492, suggesting instead that there were prehistoric connections across the Atlantic. Further south, along the Pacific coast of Mexico in the states of Guerrero and Oaxaca, live communities known as the Negro Costa Chicans. For centuries, their history has been dismissed by outsiders, who assumed they were simply the descendants of escaped African slaves. However, their own oral traditions tell a different story. They claim to be indigenous to the region, insisting that their roots in the land are as deep as any other native group. Recent genetic studies have begun to support their claims, revealing a unique genetic profile that blends ancient American and African lineages in a way that is inconsistent with a post-colonial origin. Their identity is a living testament to a history that has been systematically erased. This genetic evidence forces us to redraw the family tree of the Americas. It suggests that the continent's population history is not a simple linear story, but a braided river, with streams of people arriving from different directions at different times. The first stream appears to have flowed from Africa, establishing a foundational population. A later, larger stream flowed from Asia, and over millennia, this new population became dominant. But the genetic markers of those first African explorers were not entirely erased. They survive today in groups like the Maya and the Negro Costa Chicans, a permanent and living record of America's oldest and most surprising African roots. To truly grasp the scale of this ancient African presence in the Americas, we must zoom out and look at the global dispersal of the very first modern humans. According to the research of pioneering scholars like the great Cheikh Anta Diop, the earliest Homo sapiens to spread across the globe were diminutive or short-statured African people. These groups, sometimes referred to as the Anu or Twa, ancestors of modern pygmy peoples, originated in Africa's Great Lakes and Nile Valley region. They were humanity's original pioneers, and evidence of their presence can be found not just in Africa but across Asia, Europe, and most importantly, the Americas. These diminutive Africans were the master builders and innovators of the ancient world. They are credited with bringing the Aurignacian tool culture to Europe 40,000 years ago, and their legacy is found in the earliest layers of civilization everywhere. In the Americas, their descendants can be identified among groups like the Yagan and Alakuluf peoples of Tierra del Fuego, at the extreme southern tip of South America. These groups were noted by early European explorers for their short stature and their incredible resilience in one of the world's harshest environments. Their location at the very end of the continent is consistent with a north-to-south migration that began with an Atlantic crossing into Brazil. The DNA of these Anu or TWA peoples appears to have entered North America from two different directions, painting a picture of a truly global presence. The first and oldest migration path seems to have been from Africa, across the Atlantic into South America, and then gradually moving northward, up the continent. A second, much later migration appears to have come from the other direction, as related groups who had populated Eurasia for millennia eventually moved from Scandinavia into Canada. This dual entry helps explain the complex distribution of certain genetic markers and phenotypes among different indigenous groups across both North and South America. This global perspective, championed by scholars from Webb Du Bois to Ivan van Sertima, reveals that the African presence in the ancient Americas was not an accident, but part of a worldwide expansion. These were not lost fishermen blown off course, they were part of a sophisticated and widespread culture of exploration. Understanding the role of the Anu as the planet's original colonizers provides the crucial context for their arrival in the Americas. They were simply continuing a journey that their ancestors had begun tens of thousands of years earlier, a journey to settle every corner of the habitable world. The Americas were not the last frontier, but simply the next one. Beyond bones and genes, the most evocative evidence of an ancient African presence in the Americas is carved in stone. Across Mesoamerica, archaeologists have unearthed stunning sculptures and artifacts that date back thousands of years and bear features that are unmistakably African. The most famous of these are the colossal stone heads of the Olmec civilization, which flourished in the lowlands of south-central Mexico between 1500 BC and 400 BC. These massive monuments, carved from volcanic basalt and weighing up to 50 tons, depict regal, powerful figures with full lips, broad noses, and helmet-like headgear. Their phenotype is so distinctly non-American that their African origin seems self-evident to many observers. For years, mainstream archaeology dismissed these features as stylistic conventions or exaggerated representations of local rulers. But this explanation wears thin when you consider the consistency of the features across dozens of heads, and compare them with other Olmec art, which depicts different physical types. Furthermore, pre-classic iconography from other peoples in the region, like the Sharia and Okos, also shows figures with clearly African characteristics. More astonishing still are the statues found submerged off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, which have been dated to between 15,000 and 12,000 BC, an era that fits perfectly with the proposed timeline of a pre-Bering Strait migration from Africa. The technological connections are just as compelling. The advanced Solutrean tool culture, which appears in North America, has long been a puzzle. For years it was thought to have originated in Iberia, Spain and Portugal, and arrived via a northern Atlantic crossing. However, more recent research suggests that the Solutrean tool-making tradition itself originated in Africa before it ever spread to Europe. This provides a direct technological link between Africa and the Americas, suggesting that the knowledge of how to create these sophisticated tools was carried across the Atlantic by ancient African mariners, independent of any European connection. These artifacts and technologies are not isolated curiosities. They are part of a broad pattern of cultural evidence that complements the biological data. They are the whispers in stone left behind by a civilization that has been largely forgotten. When we look at the Olmec heads, we are not just seeing stylized art. We are looking into the faces of America's first kings, pioneers who brought their culture, their technology, and their very likeness across the ocean. The stone, like the bone, tells a story of an African genesis for American civilization, a story that is too powerful and too persistent to be ignored any longer. For a long time, the story of an African discovery of America remained on the fringes, confined to passionate independent scholars and books that were often dismissed by the academic establishment. But the ground is shifting. The weight of the evidence, from genetics, archaeology, and craniometry, has become too substantial to ignore. As a result, major institutions are beginning to create space for this new, more complex narrative. Museums, as the primary custodians of our collective past, are starting to update their galleries and exhibitions to reflect this evolving understanding and to encourage the public to ask new questions about our deepest history. A landmark event in this institutional shift occurred in May 2025, when the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York reopened its Michael C. Rockefeller wing. This immense project reimagined the presentation of the arts of Africa, the ancient Americas, and Oceania. Instead of displaying these cultures in isolated, geographically separate galleries, the new design emphasizes connections, dialogues, and shared histories across continents. It provides a powerful institutional platform for exploring the deep historical links between Africa and the Americas, moving the conversation from the margins to the mainstream. This is a crucial step in correcting the historical record and honoring the true complexity of our global heritage. This change is not just about adding new labels to old artifacts. It is about fundamentally rethinking the way we frame human history. It involves acknowledging that indigenous traditions in the Americas have a past that is far deeper and more globally connected than previously admitted. It means creating a space where the oral histories of groups like the Negro Costa Chicans are treated with the same respect as written academic papers. Museums and universities are beginning to foster a more inclusive and honest dialogue, one that empowers communities to reclaim their own histories and challenges the colonial-era narratives that have dominated for so long. The story of the first Americans is still unfolding. What we know today is likely only a fraction of what we will discover in the coming decades as new technologies allow us to analyze ancient DNA more precisely and explore archaeological sites with greater accuracy. The conclusion we can draw today is that the old simple story of a single migration across the Bering Strait is no longer tenable. The evidence strongly points to a much earlier foundational migration from Africa. This does not erase the history of the peoples who came from Asia, it simply adds an earlier foundational chapter. It enriches our understanding of the human story, reminding us that the oceans have always been bridges, not barriers, and that the roots of the American family tree are deeper, more diverse, and more wonderfully complex than we ever imagined.